What's up? I'm sitting watching my daughter having a swim lesson. I've got my Gabby's Dollhouse birthday t-shirt on, and I am tired of running for shade. And aren't you tired of being hustled and played? And aren't we all tired of crying about how hard it is to be black in America, even if it looks like we've got it made?
Malcolm-Jamal Warner, known to millions as the beloved Theo Huxtable, has died at the age of 50. In what authorities described as a drowning accident while he was vacationing with his family in Costa Rica. But the circumstances and the words he left behind have left many questioning. This was truly just another tragic loss or part of a much deeper and more troubling pattern. Because in the days before his death, Warner had delivered a message that fans now hear as both a farewell and a warning. Speaking through the final episode of his podcast, Not All Hood, only 2 days before his passing, where his reflections carried an urgency and weight that seemed almost prophetic, opening with a conversation he had with spoken word artist Tamika Georgia. May Harper, who challenged the title of his podcast with the remark, "Ain't nothing wrong with the hood," prompting Warner to explore how the media has for generations sold a narrow, often harmful narrative of black life, focusing only on certain depictions while ignoring the complexity, richness, and resilience within the community. And in his own words, he made it clear that the so-called hood side had always been the creative heartbeat of American culture, a statement that was as much about reclaiming identity as it was about exposing appropriation and erasure. And Warner also took time in that final conversation to examine the phrase "black excellence," explaining how his perspective shifted from skepticism over its ties to fame and wealth to an understanding that survival itself in a world set against you is a form of excellence, sharing a story about black soldiers erased from the records of Arlington National Cemetery as an example of contributions are often buried, and his assertion that just survival is itself black excellence resonated deeply with listeners, especially when heard now through the lens of his sudden passing. And while he was remembered by many for his long-standing role as Theo, the kind-hearted and relatable son on The Cosby Show, the real Malcolm-Jamal Warner was a man who quietly endured personal tragedies, career-altering controversies, and the shadow of a mentor's public disgrace, all while maintaining a thoughtful and measured voice in public life. And when the Bill Cosby scandal erupted with more than 50 women accusing the actor of serious misconduct, found himself in the impossible position of balancing personal loyalty with the moral weight of the allegations, choosing neither to defend Cosby outright nor to condemn him publicly, instead calling the situation painful on all sides and criticizing the media's circus-like handling of the story, noting that while the accusations varied, the damage to The Cosby Show's legacy was immense, with the show pulled from syndication and its cultural impact threatened, something Warner mourned not only for its historical representation of a positive black family, but also for the financial blow it dealt to those who had worked on it, pointing out the hypocrisy of allowing works by controversial figures such as Woody Allen and Roman Polanski to continue circulating while The Cosby Show was erased. And yet, even in his frustration, Warner's perspective evolved after a conversation with his television sister Keshia Knight Pulliam, who reminded him that the show had inspired generations, an idea that shifted him from a focus on what had been lost to an appreciation for the real-world changes it had inspired, showing his ability to adapt his thinking and separate the art's positive influence from the personal failings of its creator. And throughout all of this, Warner's own life stood out for what it lacked: the scandals, addictions, and public meltdowns that claimed so many child stars of his generation, a stability he credited to the discipline instilled by his mother, Pamela, who managed his career from the start, as well as his deliberate choice to move beyond Theo, directing episodes of television like Kenan and Kel, becoming a Grammy-winning musician and spoken word artist, and acting in a range of roles from Malcolm and Eddie to Suits, an American crime story, proving that his career was the result of steady, intentional work rather than fleeting fame. And while he faced heartbreak in his personal life from the quiet grief of losing his former girlfriend and Cosby Show co-star Michelle Thomas to stomach cancer in 1998, very public breakup with Regina King in 2013, which reinforced his commitment to keeping his private life out of the spotlight, these experiences only seemed to deepen his perspective and sharpen his boundaries, shaping a man who valued authenticity, resilience, and truth. Commitment to truth was clear in his work on Not All Hood, where he challenged sanitized portrayals of blackness and highlighted overlooked realities, even offering subtle critiques of Hollywood's racial dynamics, such as his carefully phrased comments about working with Meghan Markle on Suits, where his tone suggested a quiet awareness of how proximity to whiteness can influence perception. And now, in the wake of his passing, fans are revisiting those final words with a sense that Warner may have been trying to leave a breadcrumb trail, speaking of cultural erasure, of communities demonized despite birthing greatness, of survival as the truest measure of success. And with his sudden death coming just 48 hours later, many see a disturbing pattern in which prominent black voices from Chadwick Boseman to Nipsey Hussle are silenced just as their messages begin to gain broader traction, raising questions about whether Warner's loss was truly an accident or another instance in a long history of tragedies that strike those who dare to speak too openly about uncomfortable truths. In the days following Malcolm-Jamal Warner's death, the official story painted a picture of an unfortunate accident, a sudden drowning caused by strong currents, while he was vacationing with his family in Costa Rica. But for those who knew him, those who had been listening closely to his words, and following the evolution of his work, this explanation felt incomplete, because Warner had not been a man adrift or disengaged from life. Rather, he was at a creative and intellectual peak, using his podcast Not All Hood to dismantle stereotypes, reclaim narratives, and encourage conversations that challenged long-standing media portrayals of black life. And in that final episode, recorded just 2 days before his death, his tone carried the weight of someone who understood the urgency of his message, blending cultural critique with personal reflection, weaving in the story of how spoken word artist Tamika Georgia May Harper's comment, "Ain't nothing wrong with the hood," made him examine the ways in which black culture, particularly the elements rooted in the hood, had been commodified, misunderstood, and appropriated by the very systems that marginalized it. And he connected these ideas to the concept of black excellence, shifting it away from the metrics of fame, money, and awards, and grounding it instead in the survival, endurance, and quiet victories of everyday black life. A reframing that hit with powerful resonance in retrospect, given the brevity of his own remaining days, and the shock of his sudden passing sent ripples not only through his fanbase, but also through a broader community that saw in him a rare combination of artistic talent, moral clarity, and grounded humility. The same qualities that had set him apart as a child actor when Bill Cosby handpicked the 13-year-old Warner for the role of Theo Huxtable after a nationwide search, a casting that led to a formative relationship with Cosby, one part mentorship, one part father figure that would later be tested and strained by the avalanche of allegations against the elder star. And Warner's handling of that scandal revealed just how carefully he navigated conflict, refusing to simply choose a side for public approval, and instead speaking honestly about the pain of hearing women's stories of abuse, while also acknowledging the personal difficulty of watching a mentor fall, calling the media coverage a circus, and highlighting the double standards. Works and legacies are preserved or erased depending on the person involved. But Warner's frustrations over the erasure of the Cosby Show's cultural contributions were tempered by Keshia Knight Pulliam's reminder that its positive influence had already taken root in generations of viewers. In perspective that became emblematic of Warner's approach to life and ability to hold grief and gratitude at the same time, to accept loss without erasing what had been meaningful, and this capacity for nuanced thought was something he carried into every facet of his career, from his decision to diversify into directing, music, and spoken word to his steadfast avoidance of the destructive patterns that consumed many of his peers. And while Warner kept his personal life shielded from the media as much as possible, two deeply formative relationships became public touchstones in understanding his private world: his enduring friendship and past romance with Michelle Thomas, whose death from stomach cancer at just 30 left him grieving quietly, and his high-profile but ultimately painful breakup with Regina King, which reportedly ended abruptly and underscored his desire to protect his peace from the scrutiny of the public eye. And it's through these personal losses, along with the weight of carrying a legacy touched by both groundbreaking representation and scandal, that Warner's voice in his final days takes on such haunting clarity, because he was not speaking as a detached commentator, but as someone who had lived the layered reality of Black life in America, the triumphs, the erasures, the resilience, and the contradictions. And as his fans began revisiting his podcast episodes, a pattern emerged, a thread running through his reflections on cultural erasure, his critiques of Hollywood's racial politics, his insistence on reframing success as survival, and even in the seemingly offhand remarks he made about figures like Meghan Markle, where a subtle critique of how Black identity is navigated in predominantly white spaces hinted at a much larger awareness of the structures at play. And in the wake of his passing, the absence of a large-scale Hollywood tribute or memorial raised eyebrows, as it seemed incongruous with the decades of cultural imprint he had left, adding fuel to the suspicions of those who saw in Warner's death more than just an accident, instead recognizing in it the same troubling timing seen in other high-profile losses. Chadwick Boseman's quiet battle with cancer ending just as he was redefining Black heroism on screen, Nipsey Hussle's murder following his advocacy for economic empowerment and community ownership, and Dave Chappelle's near cancellation after rejecting industry control and speaking his mind, a sequence of events that to many feels like more than coincidence. And in this light, Warner's final message becomes not just a personal reflection, but a broader cultural warning, urging listeners to look deeper, to value truth over sanitized narratives, and to understand that telling certain truths can be both empowering and dangerous, especially in industries and systems that benefit from keeping certain conversations off the table. As the shock of Malcolm-Jamal Warner's death began to settle into a heavy, unresolved grief, the conversations around him shifted from mourning to examining the deeper context of his life, his work, and the unsettling circumstances surrounding his final days. Because Warner was not simply another Hollywood figure whose career had faded quietly into nostalgia, he was a man actively engaged in reframing Black narratives, challenging long-held stereotypes, and offering an unfiltered perspective that cut through the industry's polished, marketable version of Black culture. And the abrupt end to that voice so soon after the release of his most direct and vulnerable podcast episode felt like a blow not just to fans, but to the ongoing conversation he was trying to expand, especially given the absence of a full-scale tribute from the entertainment industry, which seemed to prefer his silence to his evolving truth-telling. And that absence was magnified when people began placing Warner's death alongside other instances where prominent Black figures who spoke candidly about identity, power, and systemic inequality met sudden or untimely ends. A list that for many has grown too long to ignore, including Chadwick Boseman, whose passing was marked by a profound cultural void, Nipsey Hussle, whose life was cut short just as his community-based economic vision was gaining ground, and even comedians like Dave Chappelle, who faced intense backlash for refusing to conform to industry demands, all of which gave Warner's own story the shape of a pattern rather than an isolated tragedy. And in revisiting his final recorded words, listeners began to find what felt like breadcrumbs, deliberate or not, pointing toward a man fully aware of both the urgency and the risk of his work, from his insistence that black survival in and of itself is black excellence, to his reflections on cultural erasure and the hidden costs of assimilation, and even his subtle but pointed comments about Meghan Markle hinted at a deeper critique of how proximity to whiteness can be rewarded while more complex and unapologetic expressions of black identity are sidelined. A critique that, though understated, resonated sharply with audiences tired of seeing diluted versions of themselves in mainstream media. And it was this layered, fearless honesty that made Warner's platform feel dangerous to the status quo, because not all hood was not designed to be palatable to corporate gatekeepers. It was designed to be real, inclusive of all the textures and truths of black life, from the beauty of its creative roots to the pain of its systemic challenges. And in the wake of his death, the lack of meaningful acknowledgement from Hollywood only underscored the industry's discomfort with the kind of complexity Warner embodied. For while he had been beloved as Theo Huxtable, the charming, relatable TV son in a neatly packaged family sitcom, the man he became as an adult did not fit so easily into their promotional reels or nostalgia specials. He was thoughtful without being safe, culturally engaged without being easily commodified, and committed to pushing conversations that extended far beyond the comfort zone of mainstream entertainment. And perhaps that is why, when his life ended so suddenly, the reaction felt muted compared to his impact, because truly honoring him would have required facing the very truths he spent his final years amplifying. Truths about appropriation, about survival as a form of excellence, and about the persistent erasure of narratives that challenge the narrow lanes black voices are too often forced into. And so, for those who followed his work closely, the task now is not just to remember Malcolm-Jamal Warner as the young actor who made millions laugh and inspired countless viewers, but to carry forward the depth and urgency of his later message, to treat his final words not as a farewell, but as a charge to question, to challenge, to refuse the comfortable erasures, and to recognize that in a culture where speaking truth can come at the highest cost, every unfiltered voice becomes an act of both resistance and legacy, and in doing so, perhaps we can ensure that Warner's story is not reduced to a single tragic headline, but remembered as a testament to what it means to live, speak, and create with purpose, even when the world would prefer your silence.